Welcome back, my friends. A review, continuing our review about Unit 1. And today, this video is going to go over research and methods that are used by psychologists to learn what they have learned. So again, hopefully by the end of this, you won't be like Mr. Castle and struggling to tell people about it. Looks like I was struggling there. All right, so experimental method is the primary method of inquiry in psychology. Like any science, experimental method is the main way that we learn what we learn. The key features are control over the variables, careful measurement, so we're able to control what happens, we're able to measure it very carefully, and we're able to establish cause and effect relationships. You'll notice that's in yellow with asterisks. The only way we can establish cause and effect relationship is with an experiment. There is no other method of research that we can use to establish cause and effect relationship. And an experiment is basically any investigation in which a hypothesis is scientifically tested. So we can have different forms. We can have them in a lab, we can have them outside of a lab. It doesn't really matter. And I've got some of the forms here that I want to go through. See if I can slide myself in there. There we go. Um, the most common one that we're used to, of course, is the laboratory experiment, which is conducted in a very well-controlled environment. It doesn't always have to be in a lab, but it is an extremely well-controlled experiment. And all of the variables in a lab experiment can be controlled. So this is an advantage. You know exactly what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. Cause and effect is very easy to see. It's extremely easy to replicate, so you can have your results tested and validated. It's very artificial though. That's the problem. When you're in a lab, you might act differently than you would, say, out on the street. And there's something called demand characteristics. When someone participates in an experiment, they're kind of trying to figure out like what's the goal of the experiment. So when an experimenter comes in and says, I want you to do this, based on how the experimenter looks, how they act, it could kind of bias how the person reacts. So they might look at the person and say, well, I think you want this. So normally I would behave like this, but because I think you want this instead, I'm going to behave like that. So it can kind of affect that behavior. So sometimes the results you get are a little bit skewed in a lab experiment. A field experiment is one that's done in a more natural setting, usually outside of a lab. It's more likely to reflect real life because the people involved in your experiment don't always know that they're in an experiment. But the downside is that you have less control over your extraneous variables. So things can happen that you might not be able to control. It's difficult for another scientist to replicate because, you know, what happens? Maybe the other scientist can't get it to happen again. And then the least restricted form of an experiment is natural experiments. They're very much like real life. There's very little effect on the participant. So a participant's not trying to figure out what you want because they don't even know they're in an experiment usually. But the downside is when you get to a natural experiment, there's almost no control over variables. So for example, if you're watching how children interact in a certain way, but then it starts to rain and the kids are outside, there's not really anything you can do about that. That might skew your results. They're very expensive and time consuming because natural experiments generally require a lot more work and they're really hard to replicate. So as you can see, as we move from the most controlled to the least controlled, there's advantages and disadvantages for each kind of experimental method. So let's talk about some terminology that goes with experiments. This is really important, and I want to start down here with our variables. Variables, when we talk about an experiment, we're basically talking about like what are we changing? And then what is the reaction because of it? So an independent variable is the one that you change, which to me always sounds weird. I don't know why, but independent to me seems like you leave it alone, but that's not it at all. It's the variable that you change. It's the variable that you are changing with the hope of seeing what the effect is. So it's like the cause. The dependent variable down here, if you look, the red, this is the variable the experimenter measures. So this is the effect. So for example, if you're participating in an experiment in which someone says to you, if you pick the correct card, I'll give you a cookie. Let's just say you like cookies, just go with me here. Um, the card would be the independent variable, and the dependent variable would be you. How do you react trying to get that cookie? Okay, an extraneous variable, these are variables that are not the independent variable that could affect your experiment, so you need to control them. So for example, when you do an experiment, you might need to consider, does the person in the experiment like cookies? Does the person in the experiment have allergies? Does the person, have they eaten recently? So you need to kind of look at all of these things because they can affect the results, but they're not what you want to test for. And your confounding variable. This is something that will actually affect the experiment, but it's not the independent variable. It might be something you should have controlled, but it might not. You know, let's go back to your experiment. And so the idea is if you pick the correct card, I will give you a cookie. So the independent variable being that card, you being the dependent variable, and I've controlled all the extraneous variables. I've made sure you haven't eaten for an hour. I've made sure that you like cookies, that this particular cookie you're not allergic to. But then the building catches fire. Well, I couldn't have foreseen that. That's random. But that's a confounding variable because chances are good instead of picking cards, you're going to get up and run. So that can be, or it might affect you because you might be too distracted trying to figure out what's going on over there that you don't pick the correct card. All right, now some of the things we've talked about that you need to watch if you're making an experiment. One is ecological validity. What's the good of investigating something that doesn't have a real life component to it, right? I mean, okay, great. We know that, children prefer yellow bananas over purple bananas, but how often are they going to be exposed to purple bananas? We need to come up with some kind of experiment that actually represents something that's more like real life. An experimenter effect. How does an experimenter accidentally influence the participant through their appearance or behavior? If I come in wearing a nice white lab coat and my hair is done well and I have a little bit of makeup on and I start talking to you, I have clipboard, you're going to take me very seriously. But if I walk in and I'm like this, in my exercise clothes and my hair is a mess and I have no makeup on, I'm like, yo, you want to do an experiment? You may not react to me in the appropriate way. So I have to watch as an experimenter that I present myself appropriately to each of the subjects in the experiment. And the last is demand characteristics, which we talked about before. This is where the person participating in the experiment kind of watches the experimenter and tries to get ideas about what they may want. And again, this can skew your results, so you have to be careful about making sure that you're very, you don't give them an idea of what you want them to do, that you just kind of tell them about the experiment and then back off and let them figure it out from there. All right. Now here's the thing. When we talk about experiments, that's not the only way that we can investigate things in psychology. It's the only way we can get cause and effect. But sometimes we're not looking for cause and effect. We're just looking to see if two variables are related, if there's some kind of underlying relationship between them. We could look at humans versus a species of animal. Maybe in a certain area, the humans are behaving in a certain way and the animals have changed their behavior. And we might look to see, is there something underlying that's linking them both? Okay, a relationship. It doesn't mean that the humans and the animals are causing each other's behavior. It just means that they're somehow related. So let's imagine, I'll give you a good example here, that it's summer and it's 99 degrees outside or more, and it has been hotter every day than the last. Oh my goodness. Click. Sorry. And you go to an ice cream store, and when you walk in, you happen to notice they have a really good sale on sunglasses, which is awesome because your favorite pair just broke and you really need a pair of sunglasses because it's super bright and sunny outside. So you decide to buy a pair of sunglasses. And as I mentioned, it's so hot outside. So you figure, well, I'm already in an ice cream store. I'll buy some ice cream while I'm here too. Okay? So at the end of the month, the ice cream store is kind of looking at their sales of different things and they notice something very interesting. Sorry, my mouse is not clicking for me the way it's supposed to. They noticed that as the sale of their sunglasses has gone up, so has the sale of their ice cream. And the question becomes, what do we notice about that? Does this mean that when people buy sunglasses, sunglasses make them want ice cream? No, you cannot prove causation because you cannot prove that sunglasses make people want ice cream. All you can prove is that there has to be some kind of correlation, something that links these two things together. There's some kind of a relationship, but we don't know what it is. Now, of course, you and I know what it is. It's the heat of the summer and the brightness of the sun. People are hot, people want sunglasses to protect their eyes, and they want some ice cream to cool down. But when we talk about relationships and psychology, sometimes what we're looking for is what is relating those two. So the first thing we're looking at is there a relationship between these variables, in this case sunglasses and ice cream, and then what is it? Okay? So we might be doing something called a correlational study sometimes when we're talking about um, psychology. We might be looking, like I said, to find that link between two variables. And it can tell us about a relationship. Um, Sorry, you can't really see my cartoon. I'll move myself back here for a moment. This was an I just thought this was a funny cartoon. The rat is saying every time he presses the lever, the postgraduate student breathes a sigh of relief. What's the relationship between humans and rats? Well, in that case, it's the fact that the rats are in an experiment and the human is looking to see if the experiment is working. When you are trying to figure out if there's a relationship, you have to do math. And you will end up with a number that is a percentage. And percentages, as we know, when written as decimal points, are less than 1 because 1 equals 100%. So the closer the number gets to 1, the stronger the relationship is. So the bigger the number, the stronger the relationship. Now, sometimes you'll see that relationships are positive, and sometimes you'll see that they're negative. Now, when you're in math class, if your teacher asks you to plot these numbers on a number line and then asks you which one's bigger, well, we all know the positive's always bigger than the negative, right? Not the same thing in psychology. When we're doing correlational studies, positive and negative mean something a little bit different. Remember our sunglasses? When our sunglass sales rose, our ice cream sales rose, right? And so the more they went up as it got hotter outside, this is a positive correlation. It's when the two variables are growing together. So their relationship is very strong and they're growing in the same direction. Conversely, in the winter, maybe the sale of ice cream goes down and the sale of sunglasses goes down. That would also be positive. I know, this is weird, but it's positive because they're falling together. But what about jeans? Anybody like to buy jeans? What happens if the price of your jeans keeps going up and up and up? We buy less, right? So the price goes up, the demand goes down. This would be what's called a negative correlation because while one is going up, one is going down. Okay, so if the sale of our ice cream went up, but the sale of our sunglasses went down, that would be negative. But because they go up together, that's positive. I know. Here in psychology, we love to play with your brains. I'm telling you, man. So the bigger the number, the stronger the relationship. Really important with correlational studies. So negative 0.95 would be bigger than positive 0.46 because we're only looking at the number, not the sign. Got it? Okay. So sometimes in psychology, we might ask questions. For example, here I'm asking you a quick question. What's the best way you learn? Is it by listening to a lecture or story? Is it by reading and taking notes? By building or drawing something? Or maybe I haven't even listed your way here. What I've created is a quick survey or questionnaire. Questionnaires are given typically with a pencil and paper or online. You might be asked to take one. And they're administered to whomever chooses to participate, called the respondents. Generally, questionnaires are fairly closed-ended, yes or no questions, A, B, C, or D, multiple choice questions, because you're trying to get a kind of a quick look at a broad variety of people. There are sometimes questionnaires that will ask open-ended questions, which is good because it allows people to go in detail, but it also kind of allows them to go in their own direction, which may not be the direction that the psychologist wanted them to go. So questionnaires can be good to get information from a wide variety of people kind of quickly, but if you want to do an open-ended questionnaire, then it's a little bit different. Another way psychologists can get information is through the survey or interview method. Interviews are more personal and probing than questionnaires. You can ask follow-up questions. You might do a face-to-face interview, a phone, or an online interview. They're useful because you kind of get a detailed picture of something from each person. They're harder because they take longer to do because you have to sit down and talk to a bunch of people. Another thing you can do in psychology is surveys, excuse me. Surveys are a quick way to gather information on a very specific topic from a wide variety of people. You could try, there's two different kinds of surveys. One's a cross-sectional survey. This is where you want to know about a specific topic, but you want to talk to people of different genders, different backgrounds, different ages. So for example, a researcher might do a cross-sectional survey about teenagers' views on cigarettes. So this might be as of May 2010, so just a quick snapshot, but using kids from ages 13 to 19 and what do they think? So this is using a variety of ages. You might look at how women feel about the I don't know, current political climate. I'm just picking something there. And maybe you look at women from ages 18 to 85. Okay, so you're looking at what they think of the political climate today, February 2017, but you're looking at a variety of ages, so a cross section of women. This is a great way to possibly identify relationships between variables. So you could do a correlational study, you can also do a cross-sectional survey. You might do a longitudinal survey, which is where you gather information over a period of time, over weeks, months, or years, from one point of time to another. So you might ask a group of 13-year-olds, what do you think about smoking? And 3 years from now, you ask that same group of kids who are now 16, what do you think of smoking? 3 years from now, you ask them again, what do you think of smoking? And you might do that until they're 30 or whatever the math would work out to be there. And the idea is that you're collecting this data and examining it for changes over time. So this is another option that psychologists have. Now, we use some important terms that we really need to consider: validity and reliability. And we use them in our everyday life differently than they're used in psychology. So sometimes people might ask you, do you feel validated? Or maybe they'll say, oh, she's looking for validation, let's say. What we're asking then is whether or not that person feels like it's correct or feels like they're being listened to or acknowledged. But in psychology, if we ask if a test, an experiment, whatever is valid, we're asking whether or not it measures what it claims to measure. So if you do an experiment where you're measuring whether or not like a depth perception experiment where you're measuring whether or not the child has the ability to recognize the difference in height on something based on depth perception, and you start measuring whether or not that child has green eyes, it's not a valid experiment. It has to measure what it claims to measure. It doesn't mean that it has to prove the hypothesis. It just means that they have to measure what they say they're going to. So if you take a personality test and it measures your personality, it's valid. But what if you think to yourself, but I don't like the answer of this personality test? Does that make it less valid? No. If it measured personality, even if you don't like how it measured it, it is valid. Now, you may not use those results because you may find something is skewed within it, but it does mean that it is valid because it measured what it claimed to measure, which is personality. If it only measures your IQ, for example, that's different. Then it would be invalid. Now, how about reliable? Well, things that are reliable generally work, right? We can trust them. But in psychology, when we talk about a study or a test or experiment being reliable, we're talking about whether or not we get the same answers every time if we gave the same or similar answers to our test. So let's say we're taking a personality test and we give the same answers both times we take it, we should get the same results, right? Well, if it's reliable, we will, or we'll get very similar results if we made like a tiny change. What if I give answers the first time and give completely different answers the second time? Well, if it's reliable, I'd better get different answers, right? If I get the same thing, then it's like, how did that happen? So if you're like part of a cross-sectional survey on teen smoking and both times you say, no, I don't smoke, and the first time they say you're a non-smoker and the second time they say you're a smoker, well, that's not reliable. So if you give the same or similar answers, you should get the same or similar results. So my friends, a quick review. I know it's a little bit longer than I anticipated, but it does help us hit the highlights of Unit 1. There's still lots of good information on the OHS, so if you have questions, I encourage you to check it out. Let me know if you'd like to get together to review anything, and thank you so much for watching.